Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're listening to today. And welcome to TME Presents Leading the Way in a Crisis Event. You've read the article, so now learn the rest of the story. I'm Daniel Wheatley, the Associate Editor for the Military Engineer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. Before we get started, though, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to best participate in today's event. All of our attendees are in a listen-only mode for the presentation. You can use the chat pane to chat with your fellow attendees. Let's try that now by typing in where we're all listening from today. You can submit questions for our presenter at any time by using the questions pane of your control panel. Click on the thumbs up icon below any question you like to upvote it and help it rise to the top of the list. We will collect these and address as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please also submit any technical issues you may be encountering here as well. At the end of the presentation, we'll make the slide deck and PDH certificate available for download from the Handouts tab. The PDH certificate will also be emailed out after the presentation in case you forget. Originally published in the January-February 2022 issue of TME, Leading the Way in a Crisis Event shared a first-person perspective of the Afghanistan non-combatant evacuation operation at Udeid Air Base. During this operation, which quickly became the largest humanitarian airlift in history, members of the 379th Expeditionary Civil Engineering Squadron, working with the 1st Expeditionary Civil Engineer Group and the Qatari Air Force, established and maintained critical infrastructure to receive, process, and house over 57,000 Afghan refugees over the course of 17 days. I would now like to introduce the article's author and today's featured speaker. Captain Jenee Jagoda currently serves as the Engineering Flight Commander, 28th Civil Engineer Squadron at Ellsworth Air Force Base, South Dakota. She is responsible for leading a team of 35 military and civil engineers in the programming, design, and construction of base engineering projects in support of $1.7 billion worth of infrastructure and the B-21 bed down. In 2021, Captain Jagoda was deployed to Udeid, during which time she was directly involved in the Afghanistan non-combatant evacuation operation as a member of the Emergency Operations Center. With that, I turn it over to Captain Jagoda for today's featured presentation.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mr. Wheatley, and thank you for the opportunity to present and kind of share this story as well. I appreciate it. To those of you who are tuning in, thanks for being here. This is a topic I'm really passionate about. We're also coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the first flight landing at Udeid. That'll be next week. So it's kind of a cool time to reflect back on the experience and some of the lessons learned while I was deployed. So this wouldn't be an Air Force brief if I didn't start off with a disclaimer. So the views expressed in this briefing are mine, and they don't represent the official position of the Air Force, the DoD, or the US government. But I wanted to provide kind of one additional disclaimer too. I had the privilege of being entrusted to tell the story of literally hundreds of engineers that were involved in Operation Allies Refuge. I put the article together with a lot of input from my leadership and from the Wing Public Affairs team. But it's really my hope that I can capture and represent the accomplishments of everybody, because I was just one very small piece of this puzzle. So I just want to kind of make sure that I'm stressing that this is not my accomplishment, but it's the accomplishment of the Air Force Civil Engineer enterprise that made this happen. Before I actually kind of launch into the meat of the presentation, I wanted to play just a short video that was put together by the 379th Air Expeditionary Wing Public Affairs team. They did a great job of capturing photos and video throughout the Operation Allies Refuge, but this one I think really highlights the contributions of engineers. And for those of you who haven't been to Udeid, helps to kind of provide a lay of the land of what the base looked like. So we'll watch that, and then I'll dive into the content. All right, so to provide some background of kind of the events that led up to Operation Allies Refuge, last year on the 14th of April, President Biden announced his plan to do a full withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September 11th. This was actually just 2 days before I arrived at Udeid, so kind of set the tone for the deployment. But it wasn't until a couple months into my deployment where we really started to see the effects of that directive kind of trickle down to our day-to-day mission. So in June of last year, my squadron, the 379th Expeditionary Civil Engineer Squadron, began preparing to support a potential non-combatant evacuation operation, or NEO. At the time, we didn't know what that would look like, when it would happen, how many people we might need to house. So we developed two different tent city layouts. One was a 90 tent layout, the other one was a 270 tent layout. But once we had those plans and had done kind of some initial site reconnaissance, we shelved them until they would actually be potentially needed. About a month later, toward the end of July, 63 engineers from our squadron constructed 6 small shelter system, or triple S tents, to process special immigrant visa applicants coming out of Afghanistan. These were personnel that had helped the military in the past. We wanted to make sure that we were taking care of them should they need evacuation or exit from Afghanistan once everything kind of went underway. And then less than a month later, on the 15th of August, our wing commander received notification that the Afghan evacuations were imminent, and there were 682 U.S. Embassy personnel slated to arrive that day. The very next day, the 16th of August, was the day that Reach 871, the record-setting C-17 that carried 823 passengers, landed at Al Udeid Air Base. That morning, when I was grabbing breakfast before the flight had arrived, this newspaper headline from the Stars and Stripes was kind of at all the DFACs. And I remember just thinking how surreal it was to see it's over in such large headlines. But little did we know that while it was over for the embassy and over, with the fall of Kabul, it was really just beginning for us at Al Udeid as we prepared to all of a sudden house and process all those passengers as they began flowing in. So that first day, the 16th of August, this is kind of just a general overview of what it looked like and what we were doing to try and just react on the fly to their arrival and make those passengers comfortable. So while we had those shelved plans for the tent city, we hadn't implemented them because we didn't know this was going to happen until it was basically underway. And the manpower and resource just demands of erecting a tent city of that size made it so that it wasn't worth constructing until we actually knew that it would be required. So consequently, we didn't have the tent city up and running when that first flight landed. And it wasn't an option to just keep the passengers on the plane because it just didn't have the cooling or the restroom facilities needed to house that many people for the period of time it would take us to get ready. So kind of improvising on the fly, we came up with a solution to house all those personnel in the 2-bay hangar. So that hangar emptied of aircraft. It was right on the flight line, so it made it easier for us to get the passengers off of the plane and into the facility, kind of minimize the transportation requirement. It also had just that large amount of space that we needed to house a team of that size. Throughout the course of the day, we began delivering cots and setting those up for all the personnel. We also delivered porta-johns because the 2-bay hangar only had about 4 bathroom stalls between men and women, which obviously wouldn't last long when they had just come off of a multi-hour flight and landed there. We also provided water buffaloes that could be used for hygiene or just for drinking, as well as we plussed up the number of dumpsters that we had there, anticipating that it would be a lot more trash than what the facility normally saw in its day-to-day use. The next step was to begin building some sort of crowd control measures because it was a massive hangar with really no delineation or demarcation between spaces. So our structure shop began constructing stanchions and just kind of improvising some different barriers to help funnel people through processing lines, because one of our first steps getting them off the plane was to try and process them through the Department of State. And then to also kind of separate off areas where they could go to get food, to get clothing or supplies that they needed, as well as areas to just live and sleep. We tried on that first day to map some different potential process flows throughout the facility. But the challenge was it's difficult to kind of remap the layout and encourage people to go a different direction when there are already that many in there. There was a language barrier in trying to kind of describe what we were wanting to do. So the process flow didn't implement quite as planned, but we were trying to sort of develop a procedure on the fly that we could use to accommodate and process that many people. Another really big undertaking that our engineering team tackled that first day was trying to figure out some sort of cooling solution. So again, two-bay hangar designed for aircraft and kind of some minimal personnel. It could not handle the cooling loads of 800 plus people, all of a sudden being kind of packed in there. They just come off of a hot aircraft, so they're already sweaty and uncomfortable. And so we had to figure out some way to try and mitigate that for the refugees. What we ended up doing was borrowing a massive cooling unit from another facility on base. Our HVAC guys transported it over to the two-bay hangar and then actually constructed their own ductwork so they could kind of line up that cooling unit with an existing opening in the building and then duct it in hopes of trying to cool it. They also augmented with swamp coolers, fans, really whatever we could find to, again, just try and kind of bring that temperature down and make it a little bit more bearable for these refugees that had just come from a very different climate and arrived at Qatar at our hottest month of the year. The final major step that first day was constructing 9 SSS tents just adjacent to the two-bay hangar, and we used those for medical treatment, as well as our Office of Special Investigations, or OSI, used it to kind of vet and separate personnel that had been flagged by the Department of State as a potential risk. So that's kind of what the first day looked like, just a lot of responding on the fly and kind of troubleshooting as we went to solve these problems and figure out what to do with all these people. After that first day, as passengers continued to flow in and evacuations continued out of Afghanistan, it quickly became apparent that we did not have enough space in the two-bay hangar. We were going to have to expand our bed-down effort in order to accommodate all of those personnel. So that same day that the first flight arrived, the first Expeditionary Civil Engineer Group, or 1ECEG, began constructing a 200-tent city. So this was a little bit different than what we'd kind of looked at in our initial layouts, but just made the most sense with the time constraints and the travel and logistical constraints that we had with all these personnel. The next day, we made the decision to open up the maintenance back shop, which was located just behind the two-bay hangar off the flight line, to use as overflow. It was close enough that we could just have passengers walk from the two-bay hangar to that maintenance back shop. It also allowed us to kind of centralize porta-johns, dumpsters, supplies between those two facilities. A couple days later, the Qatari Emiri Air Force, or QEAF, recognized the need and kind of the challenges we were having with keeping up and approached us about wanting to help and wanting to support the evacuation effort, which was truly awesome. They provided support that we absolutely needed. And I don't think we would have been successful without their help in bringing sites online and in housing these refugees. But they actually emptied out one of their warehouses that was located on the flight line, actually just next to those 6 SSS tents that we'd built initially. And they not only provided the space, but they also handled a lot of the logistics for the personnel in those facilities. So helped with ensuring that they had water, that they had some form of sanitation, that trash was being handled, all of that, which was, again, just truly invaluable as we were quickly becoming stretched very thin across all these sites. The next day, we opened up 5 event tents, and these were again run by the Qataris. When I say event tents, picture like the large white wedding tents. Between these 5 tents, which were all kind of located on the same site, they had a capacity for about 3,000 people. But the best part of these tents is that because they were rented from an event, like an event equipment organization, they actually came with their own cooling, which was incredibly helpful as we were trying to mitigate just the hot weather, the humidity, the uncomfortable conditions. The Qataris took it a step further, and not only did they provide these tents and this great cooling solution, but they even brought out a piece of artificial turf and several inflatables so that all the children that were coming through had a place to play and could do something other than just kind of lie around in those tents waiting for the next steps. So again, just a really cool testament to our host nation partner and their contributions to the effort. A couple of days later, the AFCENT Director of Installations made the decision to empty out the War Reserve Material Warehouse, or WRM warehouse, and use that to house additional personnel. It took a little while just to get all the equipment and supplies out of there because we had countless pallets stored in rows throughout the facility. But once it was emptied, the ECAG, again, took responsibility for that site. They made penetrations in the side of the facility so they could hook up about 30 different ECUs, environmental control units, to try and get some cooling into that facility. And then they managed the operations, worked on getting a Porta-John contract out there to service it, and just really took the lead on getting that facility online. At its peak, that warehouse housed 6,000 personnel. So it also came at just the right time. The 23rd and 24th of August were our biggest inflow of passengers, as you can see from these graphs, as well as just kind of when we peaked in overall population on the base. Again, invaluable support from our partners as we were trying to just take care of all these refugees and ensure that they had some place to call home while they were in transition. And then the final site to come online was a hangar that the Qataris, again, lent out to us right on the flight line, so had that great logistical convenience and just gave us a little bit more space to work with as we began to kind of trickle down in the number of passengers, but we're still looking to provide the best possible quality of life while we had those Afghans with us on base. In addition, those sites kind of summarize where we actually bedded down the Afghan refugees, but we also stood up a supply distribution center to manage all the supplies that were flowing in through donations from the United States, as well as through purchases on the local economy. And then we also had to set up a containment area for select passengers. So I mentioned on the previous slide that we initially set up a couple of tents that OSI could use for their processing, but there were a number of people that were flagged by the Department of State system, and we couldn't separate them from their families. So we ended up needing to put entire families together in one location. So that site was separate from the rest of the bed down locations. It was well secured, fenced in, but again, was an important area for us to maintain as we just kind of managed the overall bed down. One more thing worth mentioning, kind of toward the end of August, we did begin prepping a second site to place some event tents. Ultimately, this wasn't needed because we realized that we peaked and we're kind of trickling down, but it was something that we pursued as a possible course of action should we have required it. So wanted to take a moment just to highlight the many diverse contributions of the civil engineer community at Udeid throughout the course of this effort. So the first thing that I wanted to highlight was the Emergency Operations Center. Once we stood at the Emergency Operations Center on the 15th of August, the day that we found out that the embassy had fallen and passengers were beginning to evacuate, we began 24/7 ops of our EOC. There were 12 engineers that rotated through the day and night shift and served in a variety of different functions. So first up, the EOC director, our Civil Engineer Squadron Commander and Deputy Squadron Commander took that role. As the directors, they were essentially running the bed down effort and having a massive play in the overall evacuation operation. We also had our EOC managers, which were our emergency management personnel, who were just ensuring that things ran smoothly and that we were tracking and having the right accountability. We had some admin personnel that were, again, just trying to kind of stay on top of everything that was going on. Because as you can imagine, especially those first few days as we tried to figure out what our roles were and how we were going to communicate, it got pretty chaotic in the EOC. And then lastly, we staffed 2 of the emergency support functions, or ESFs, the Public Works and Engineering function, which is where I worked for the duration of the operation, as well as our Fire and Emergency Services function was staffed as well. We had 2 CE units that had a massive play in this at Udeid. The first was the 379th, which was a squadron I was a part of. We were the home station squadron as part of the Air Expeditionary Wing, and so we took the lead on directing the bed down effort. This meant kind of just overseeing the overall operation, liaising with the ECAG and the Qatari Air Force, as well as our biggest role is just sustaining the key services that were essential to quality of life and just to kind of general health. And that was potable water, sewage, refuse, and then custodial services. So not the most glamorous job, especially in the thick of things, but just some really critical functions that we tend to take for granted on a day-to-day basis, but were essential to ensuring that these personnel survived, honestly, their time in the bed down. And then the ECAG was a tenant unit on base, which is why they didn't take the lead, but stepped up in some massive ways, constructing our tent city, taking the lead in ownership of our WRM warehouse to house those 6,000 personnel at the peak, and then also expanding that containment area we'd set up for our flagged personnel, and ensuring that, as more tents were needed, as the fence line had to grow, they really took the lead on making sure all of that happened. So looking now at our specific shops and just the many ways that they stepped up and acted kind of outside of their normal scope of responsibilities to make this happen. So first off, our structures shop. They constructed the 9 SSS tents at the 2-bay hangar on day 1, used for medical and OSI. They also placed security fence throughout the base. Any location that we housed personnel required some sort of fencing, concertina wire, just to ensure that we had perimeter security and accountability for all the personnel. So they were constantly responding, patching the fence if needed, moving if needed, just really reacting to wherever that support was required. And they also built these crowd control measures and placed jersey barriers, constructed stanchions, again, just did whatever they needed to engineer a solution to keep personnel in the right place and to try and maintain some order and some systematic process for the operation. Our dirt boys were instrumental in grading the event tent site where the Qataris constructed those 5 event tents, and ensuring that it was ready to receive personnel and that trucks could get in and out without any issue, without any risk of getting stuck in the sand, things like that. They also augmented the potable water delivery contract. So we quickly maxed out our kind of standing water delivery contract at Al Udeid. We ended up establishing 2 more contracts and maxing out both of those, because not only were we ordering water for the refugees, we were also just maintaining our steady state water supply for base personnel, because we drank bottled water versus the local water. And we were airlifting water into the airport in Kabul as well. So trying to keep up with that demand, really bolstered that water contract, but found that even as we were getting more of a supply of water, our contractors didn't have the equipment operators or the vehicles to distribute that water as quickly as it was needed, especially, again, in the thick of a Qatari summer. So our dirt boys began doing water routes, delivering those pallets of water to different locations as needed to just kind of help support our contractors and preempt a really dire need for that water. Another way that they just really stepped up and acted outside of their normal scope of responsibility was by augmenting our refuse contract as well. So similar to water, we maxed out the refuse contract, but even so, we weren't able to get enough vehicles on base and a robust enough timeline to keep up with the trash production. And so what we ended up deciding to do within CE to kind of help just alleviate their workload was we centrally located all of our dumpsters in what we call dumpster alley. So essentially the dirt boys would pick up full dumpsters at the operating locations across the base, bring them to dumpster alley, and then as dumpsters were emptied, take them back to those different locations. But what this did for us was it meant that when the contracted dump trucks came onto base, they could go to one centralized location, just pick up all the dumpsters, collect all the trash that they could fit, and then go right off base. It saved all the time of going, through their route, going from location to location, and just helped us kind of try and stay on top of or even get ahead of the trash production. Our water and fuel system maintenance shop, or WFSM, as you see it listed here, delivered over 70,000 gallons of clean water to 14 different water buffaloes stationed at the various operating locations. This water was used for sanitation, and was just kind of really key. We didn't have the shower, shave, or latrine units to support all of these refugees, and so this was kind of our best possible solution to make things a little bit more livable for them while they were staying with us at Al Udeid. Another critical thing, you don't like to think about this because it's definitely the dirty side of the job, but they repaired 3 pumps to avoid kind of an emergency lift station failure. So what we were finding was with the influx of personnel, not only refugees, but bringing in military from all around the AOR to try and augment the support we were providing to the refugees, we were producing a lot more sewage. And it was actually stressing our lift stations and our sanitary system to the point of potential failure. The pumps that the WFM's troops actually serviced weren't military owned. They were downstream from our on-base pumps. But in an effort to be good neighbors, good stewards to our hosts who had done a lot to support us through the different operating locations, we actually repaired those pumps to ensure that we weren't just pushing the problem literally down the line, and making it their problem. And then a final major line of effort from our WFSM troops was installing portable shower, shave, and latrine units. So as I mentioned previously, we didn't have enough of these to provide to all the refugees, unfortunately, just because at our peak, we had 9,400 flowing in on one day, and we had about 18,000 extra personnel on base at one time when we were kind of at the worst of our inflow and outflow. So couldn't provide units for all those personnel, but we did augment the shower, shave, and latrine units at the locations we were bedding down our military. So we were placing kind of those military that were forward deploying into Udeid in dorm bays, in gyms, really wherever we could find the space. And so those shower shave units were really meant for those personnel as we tried to ensure that they had a way to rest and kind of clean up after a really long day's work. HVAC, I touched on their contributions earlier, but they provided 320 tons of cooling across 3 primary facilities. They also serviced 165 trailer window units. So we had a number of trailers on the base that were slated for demolition and were no longer being serviced, with the intent of demolishing just a couple months later. But we actually brought all of those trailers back online to support the military bed down, as well as we could put some refugees in there as well. So really just kind of scrambling to get those up and running so we could make use of the facilities we had. They installed 5 deployable HVAC units at key locations and also responded to countless emergency work orders because while we were really all hands on deck and our primary focus was on Operation Allies Refuge, we still had a regular mission to run too. And HVAC was being kind of pulled in every direction to ensure that we were keeping the mission, our communication systems, all those things up and running. Pest management. So another thing that you don't necessarily think of a lot when you consider a bed down and the associated effects, but as trash began to pile up around dumpsters and eventually even in an on-base landfill that we temporarily stood up to just help deal with the trash problem, we also saw our pest population increase significantly, both in wild dogs and in rodents. And so our pest management team was out setting up large animal traps and bait stations to try and kind of mitigate the pest problem and subsequently mitigate the diseases and vectors that those pests could be carrying. And then one other shop to highlight, the electricians. So they provided our electricity and our light to 15 tents. They also were key to powering the Department of State processing and biometrics computers at multiple operating locations. There were many times, because of the number of computers and just the use those computers were getting, that we would be tripping breakers or needing to kind of troubleshoot power solutions. And our electricians were on that, just trying to keep things running and keep the process flowing. And then they also installed 4 refrigerator units at Soxent. Because again, while we had military kind of streaming in who were supporting the bed down effort, we had the refugees coming in from Afghanistan. We also had troops that were in Afghanistan that were trying to come back through. And so we were able to support them along with these other 2 kind of bed down efforts. And even more CE contributions. So the last slide focused on kind of our operations flight, which is really the heartbeat of CE in many ways, but a number of other roles that we've fulfilled. The first was service contracts. So our service contracts team worked like crazy to procure 375 additional porta-johns, augmenting what we already had on base. They also got us 255 more dumpsters, and then negotiated with all of our contractors to increase the water, sewage, refuse, and custodial services. Our EAs, or engineering assistants, surveyed 42 potential bed down locations and shelter sites across the base, just so that as we needed to open up sites, we kind of had a running list of here are places that have been vetted, their capacity, their pros and cons, to facilitate decisions down the line as the bed down got underway. They also mapped out the 14 operating locations and then produced and printed over 1,400 maps during the course of the bed down, as we just sought to keep all of our different base agencies and organizations informed and aware of where we were siting and what was going on with the bed down. Our installation management flight, which is kind of, they perform a really diverse set of functions within the CE squadron. One of their big lines of effort was increasing the squadron's vehicle fleet by 43 vehicles. So this was a mix of like heavy equipment type vehicles, trucks and trailers that could be used to actually deliver supplies and kind of transport pallets of water and dumpsters around the base. But it was also just kind of day-to-day use vehicles so that our escorts who were augmenting these increased service contracts could get those contractors around the base where they needed to go. In addition, our resource advisor, who while deployed was a senior airman, processed almost $3 million worth of purchase requests. So this included just different equipment and materials to support our work orders, as well as augmenting our service contracts and really just any purchase we needed to make to kind of keep the mission going. Our explosive ordnance disposal flight really stepped outside of their normal scope of responsibility to support the bed down effort. They conducted continuous trash runs to 5 different operating locations and removed more than 600,000 pounds of trash in the dump trucks that they were operating during that week. That was really key because I mentioned the dirt boys augmenting our refuse removal with the dumpsters, but this also, they could kind of get smaller loads when trash piled up outside of dumpsters. They were really instrumental in collecting that trash and getting it out of the way and trying to keep our population safe and healthy. The fire department, which is, again, within Air Force Civil Engineering, is part of our squadron. They were the primary first responders to every single incoming flight at Al Udeid. They cared for 7,500 patients, responded to 375 emergencies, many of which were heat-related, as they struggled to adjust to the climate. Delivered 7 babies, which was probably one of the more unexpected things out of this bed down, but a total of 9 babies were born at Al Udeid, 7 of which were delivered by our firefighters. And then lastly, they resuscitated 2 children as part of their emergency response. And then the final flight that I want to highlight is force protection. So at home station civil engineering units, force protection isn't a flight that we need, but while deployed, it's pretty critical because we use our force protection personnel to escort all of our contractors and delivery personnel on and off the base. And so our FP team bolstered the escort support to all of our key service contracts as we surged, the number of times that they came on and off the base, their hours, their routes. And they also provided 77 augmentees to security forces who used them to secure the different operating locations and just kind of maintain that perimeter security at all of our sites. So throughout the course of the bed down, as I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of challenges that we kind of faced and just had to figure out how to respond to on the fly. The first one, and the one that really was overarching throughout, especially the first half of the bed down, was while we had those on-the-shelf plans, by the time we realized that we needed the plans, we didn't have enough time to actually implement them prior to the arrival of the first load of passengers. And so as a result, for that first week and a half, 2 weeks or so, it felt like we were just purely in a reactive mode. We couldn't get ahead of the passenger inflow because as soon as we opened a new operating location, it was full of passengers, and we were already looking for the next site. It felt like we couldn't deliver water quickly enough or couldn't service, the porta-johns fast enough. It was just very much just trying to kind of put out fires and just attempting to keep our heads above water for those first few days. By the time we finally kind of caught up, we were on the downhill. So the end of the bed down effort was certainly a little bit smoother, a little bit easier, but in the beginning, it was very much just reacting and responding to whatever happened. Another challenge is Al Udeid is a deployed base, and so the vast majority of our infrastructure there is expeditionary. That meant that, obviously it wasn't designed to handle this number of personnel. And so we really had to get kind of creative with what facilities we used and how we used them. But it also meant that we didn't have the same resources available to us that we would have at home station. So that meant not only the resources we had on base, but also what we could procure locally, because we were limited by the capacity of local vendors and of local contractors. I've mentioned this several times, but I think it bears repeating again because it really is a challenge. Qatar in August is truly miserable. The average temperature is about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Average humidity is about 84%, but that makes for a real field temperature of really like 115 to 120 Fahrenheit. This was a very different climate than what the refugees were used to coming out of Afghanistan. And so just something that we had to mitigate as we were trying to work through different HVAC solutions. We were simultaneously bedding down both Afghans as well as troops. So in addition to all those operating
One moment there, everybody. Captain Jagoda is going to try to leave and come back and fix the audio problem. Thanks for sticking with us here. And while we're waiting for Captain Jagoda to restart her mic and camera in here, if you've got any questions, this is a great time. Go ahead and put them in the Q&A tab for our Q&A session at the end here. And take a look through. We've got some other great questions in here already. So if you see something that you really like, that you want to see answered here, or something else that's just interesting to you, go ahead and hit that thumbs up icon next to it. It'll help it rise through some of the other questions here, so we can get to the ones that we really want to answer.
Are you able to hear me now? Are you able to hear me now? Oh, there we go. All right, let me mute myself. Okay, I think we're good. I'm so sorry about that. Not sure what happened. Would somebody mind letting me know what the last thing was that you heard, and I'll pick up there?
We were just, you were going over the problems of the temperature, August heat, and humidity at the airbase.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. All right. Again, yeah, sorry about that. I'm not sure why my camera and mic dropped off so suddenly, but so yeah, mentioned August heat and humidity, super uncomfortable. Another challenge, and I've kind of alluded to this a few times, is that while we were trying to take care of all the Afghan refugees, we were also simultaneously bedding down our special forces troops that were coming back from Afghanistan, as well as just supporting all the personnel that were coming in from all over the Middle East, trying to help and kind of trying to support where needed. So that meant that resources were spread even more thin, and we were really trying to kind of focus on a number of different areas at the same time. We didn't have enough equipment or operators, even with that surge in the extra 43 vehicles from our installation management flight. We weren't able to source the vehicles that we needed to keep up with water deliveries, refuse deliveries. And even if we'd had the vehicles, our personnel were being used in so many different parts of the base and in so many different ways, we would have still, I think, kind of struggled to keep up with the demand. There were points where we were able to work with other units on base and kind of do an equipment share or vehicle share with them. So at one point, we borrowed the medical group's forklift and were able to use that to kind of help deliver equipment. But definitely we just didn't have the resources that we could have utilized in a perfect world. Host nation support was both a blessing and a challenge. So I stated earlier that we couldn't have done this without the support of the Qatar Emiri Air Force and their willingness to stand up and man 3 different locations. But some challenges there is, one, a language barrier. Sometimes there were times that a need got relayed to the military that were on site trying to provide support, but we weren't able to communicate that need to the Qataris that were on site. Another challenge was some of the hours that they worked. So typically they had minimal to no staffing in the evenings, but the need for these services and just different quality of life measures didn't go away at night. And so just kind of trying to navigate that and ensure that we maintained good relations and good communication, but also kind of worked through some of those shortfalls a little bit. Another thing that was tough and definitely a limiting factor was our ability to document everything that was happening. The bed down unfolded so quickly that it was difficult to kind of keep up with even just something data as simple as passenger counts and how many people we had in each facility. Stuff was constantly moving, so many different moving parts that we couldn't have kind of a perfect record of, okay, here's what we did in this facility to build it up. And couldn't necessarily always document, all right, we borrowed this piece of equipment from this unit. We didn't always have that information available to us. And kind of on a related note, keeping information flowing was also a challenge because we had so many personnel working in so many different locations. Not all of them had cell phones. Many were issued a government cell phone that they could use while in Qatar, but not everybody had it. And if they did have it, they weren't always able to respond. And so figuring out the best way to communicate to personnel across the base and ensure that we had accurate communication and accurate status updates was another just challenge we faced. And the last thing was reconstitution, which is what the photo in this picture is kind of showing. After 17 days of just nonstop work and pushing, with people working 12 to 16-hour shifts with no days off during that time, and just doing everything they could to make this bed down a success. When it finally was over and we had to clean up, that was tough. Obviously, it's a lot more fun to build things up and to construct than it is to tear down and put away. And so trying to kind of get past some of the morale challenges and just the physical and emotional exhaustion that came with it to get the base put back together quickly so we could resume our normal ops was just another kind of tricky thing to work through as we tried to keep our personnel motivated. And then kind of the last slide I'll share before I leave a few minutes for any questions that we might have is just some takeaways and lessons learned that I had during my time in the EOC and as part of this larger effort. So the first thing was definitely key to centralize our key personnel in the Emergency Operations Center. And then later on during the bed down, we also stood up a Humanitarian Operations Center. But having a key POC from each unit, so from medical, from our force support squadron, from our logistics squadron, from airfield management, really facilitated communication and ensured that we were equipping our senior leaders with the information that they needed to make decisions and to kind of press forward with the operation. Another lesson learned was the importance of siting operating locations to minimize the ground logistics, so that need to transport personnel from the aircraft to whatever location they're bedding down in, but also to minimize customs and immigration requirements. So a facility that was on the flight line, if the personnel didn't ever leave that facility, it wouldn't require them to integrate into Qatar. Whereas if we took them off the flight line and further into the heart of the base, for example, where our tent city or where our WRM warehouse were located, then we had to go through certain customs and immigration procedures, which just kind of added to a little bit of confusion with the language barrier, but more importantly, added to just the time and the overall process. So the more that we could site things on the airfield, just the better off we were with the bed down. Another big thing is we did not plan for how much refuse and how much sewage would be produced over the course of the bed down. Definitely, like, there are some significant cultural differences in the way that our refugees used water and produced wastewater and sewage. And so trying to kind of navigate just some of those cultural differences that we didn't anticipate prior to the start of the bed down, and also ensure that we were kind of supplying what they needed was challenging. But on a related note, I wrote here, NEO operations produce a lot of trash. Once we kind of got things underway and were able to establish some service contracts off base, we began bringing in food from different local caterers who could provide kosher food that met the, just some of the religious dietary restrictions that the Afghans had. But what we found was when you bring in individual meals, you're having a ton of waste. The box that the meal comes in, all the individual wrapping, and that just meant a lot more work on trash collection and ultimately getting the trash off the site and having new dumpsters in place. And again, another cultural difference is it wasn't necessarily, I think we kind of assumed, trash will go in a can and we'll take it out, but that wasn't necessarily something that the refugees were used to. And so that kind of meant a little bit more cleanup and just kind of an education piece to get things where they needed to be. Another lesson, this is something I've heard throughout my career as an officer, but it never felt more relevant than during the NEO, and that's the importance of getting away from your workstation and actually getting out there and laying eyes on the site. There would be times where, I might call a unit and ask for an update on, say, like how a fence was coming along. And then literally 10 or 15 minutes later, I would get another call asking me, if I could provide support for the fence. And what I was finding was that sometimes the information I was getting from the personnel on the ground didn't always match up. And that was, I think, just a product of information flowing in all different directions and some confusion. But oftentimes the best thing to do in that situation was to go out there myself and see what the current status of the site was, what the needs were, so that when I returned to my desk at the EOC, I could make the right calls and facilitate the right deliveries to get those sites taken care of. Another thing is to celebrate the little wins and to do what you can to maintain morale during a tough situation. A couple of kind of my favorite memories from the NEO. The first was in the EOC, we had a medical representative, and any time that a baby was born during the operation, he would announce to the whole EOC, and then if he knew the gender or the name, he would share that too. But it was just so awesome in the midst of such a stressful and kind of discouraging time to be able to celebrate new life and just to be able to kind of share in that joy together. We would cheer and clap, and it was just kind of a cool moment together in the EOC. Something else we did was anytime an aircraft took off with passengers, our airfield manager would announce the call sign and how many passengers that they were taking. And we would cheer for that too. And it got to the point where if people in the buildings, we were operating out of the wing headquarters, if they heard cheering as they were passing by, they would come into the EOC and ask us to repeat whatever the good news was so they could share in it too. So just a really, really special way to celebrate those little wins and to remember that, we were making progress, however slow, toward our end goal, which was cool. And then my last lesson learned is just to keep success and failure, whatever might be the kind of predominant feeling at the time, in perspective. So throughout the NEO, it felt like a losing battle. It felt like we couldn't keep up with demand. We couldn't provide the living conditions that the Afghans deserved, not because we weren't trying, but just because we didn't have the resources. And there was a lot of negative media coverage coming from reporters all around the world, many of whom hadn't been on the site, but were just kind of sharing what they'd heard. So definitely very discouraging, but in the grand scheme of things, we had to kind of remember that, while there were these challenges along the way, ultimately in the end, 57,000 people, which was almost half of the total evacuated population from Afghanistan, passed through Al Udeid in 2.5 weeks, and ultimately left the base and moved on to Ramstein and other forward locations in pursuit of a safer and better life. And so just really had to kind of focus on we couldn't do everything we wanted to along the way, but we got that many people out of a very dangerous situation into safety. And it was just really cool to be a part of that. So, and with that, I think we have about 8 minutes left. I would love to try and answer any questions that you have. Thanks again for listening and for kind of bearing with those tech difficulties for a couple minutes there in the middle.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Captain Jagoda, for that fascinating presentation. And we do indeed have tons of questions here in the Q&A. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them here, but we will definitely try to get to as many as we can in our time here. Just a quick note, if you do want to grab a copy of the slide deck or the PDH certificate, they're available now in the handouts tab. And like I said, the PDH certificate is also going to be mailed out in case you forget it to grab it for any reason right now as well. So our first question here comes from Sam Cruikshank here. Apologies if I mispronounce anybody's name as we're going through this. Asking what sort of software tools did you use to support this mission?
Great question. We were basically using Microsoft Office the whole time. I'm sure that there is better software out there, but we didn't have the time to look for it. And so we were kind of tracking like work orders as they came in Excel, and I would try and kind of make a note of when I got the call and what the resolution was. We tried to track passenger counts within Excel as well. I'm sure the Department of State was using something more legitimate in their biometric processing, but just within the CE squadron, working off of Excel and phone calls primarily. We also, I guess I should add, we do have a software called Chimera that we use in the Air Force for kind of a large scale effort. We didn't use it as much as we maybe could have. Just there were some limit facts, but we did use that a little bit within the EOC as well.
Fantastic, thanks. So here's a question here from Colonel Matt Altman here, SAME former board member. I think he's a former board member. So he's asking about, so the Air Force is focusing on developing multi-capable airmen, right? It's been met with some skepticism in the field. So did this experience shape your perspective on the importance of developing multi-capable airmen? Did you leverage flexible manpower support from outside civil engineering as well? And then what was your biggest limiting factor in the execution here?
Yes, sir. So, yes, great questions. Thank you. I guess the first thing, definitely it shaped my perspective on the importance of multi-capable airmen. I kind of shared a few ways that our airmen were stepping outside of their normal scope of responsibility just to do what they needed to do to get the mission done. But had that been even more well established, like say had more of them had certain vehicle training or maybe had a little bit more experience in other crafts, they could have kind of helped to fill some additional shortfalls because more or less they stuck to their shop. But I think with even more multi-capability, we would have been in a better position and just had the flexibility we needed, especially as the needs shifted as the bed down progressed. As far as leveraging support from outside CE, we would have loved to, but we didn't because, while I shared everything CE was doing, every single squadron on base was equally busy and just doing other things to make sure that the bed down was successful. contracting, was making millions of dollars worth of purchases and just trying to get all of this together so we had the resources we needed. Force support was trying to figure out how to feed this extra 18,000 people at one point. I could name contributions that every single squadron had, but unfortunately they were all so busy that we stuck with what we had and then what kind of came in from all over the AOR as well. As far as the biggest limiting factor in execution, that's a great question and one I'd probably need to really think about. I think my first answer, kind of my instinct, is just communication, just because with a bed down of that effort, especially when you don't really have the luxury of a lot of planning in place ahead of time, it's just tough to kind of relay what's happening to all the people that need to know. And there were definitely times where we lost a little bit of momentum or even passed along some incorrect information as we were trying to get things sorted out. So I think communicating the issues so we can focus on the right problems was key, but wasn't always the easiest thing to do.
All right, thank you so much, Captain Jagoda there. So a couple more. So obviously, keep the questions coming in here, everyone. Really great questions from the audience. So this one comes from Eric Turner. He says, he wondered about power reduction efforts, the grid's ability to support the added loads. He said, I recall the Qatari and the Air Force generating capacity sometimes struggled with keeping up with just regular base loads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't have a lot of data about it, and this kind of gets back to our challenge with documentation, which is part of why I didn't really touch on it in this presentation. Definitely PowerPro was involved in kind of essentially the power plant that we needed to support Tent City. And they were placing some generators at key locations, powering the ECUs at the WRM warehouse, as well as kind of providing some additional power to the Department of State computers, for all the processing they were using. So they were engaged. I don't have the data on exactly, how many generators were placed or how much power they ultimately provided, but definitely played a role as well. It just happens we have a much smaller Power Pro team than almost any other shop at Udeid, and so their role wasn't always as visible, but it was definitely crucial.
All right, thanks. Asking here, just going to go to our next one here. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more here. So Tony Price asked, so the decision to use your squadron, was that so Prime B for Red Horse units, they could remain available for contingency ops, or do you have any idea on that?
So the main reason that our squadron took the lead was that we were kind of the home station unit. So the 379th Air Expeditionary Wing, we were the CE squadron assigned to that wing, whereas the ECAG, which consists of Prime Beef and Red Horse, are considered tenants. So I think it was primarily just kind of a chain of command thing. But looking at the types of work that the ECAG did, it was a lot more contingency focused. They single-handedly did the Tent City. They did a lot of work on innovating WRM warehouse. So it did kind of, I think, play to their strengths while also trying to facilitate communication among base and wing leadership in the right way. So it really had more to do with just kind of us being the primary unit at the base, and then some members of the ECAG had already forward deployed out and were brought back to kind of augment more of that contingency side.
All right, thank you. And I did see there's a note here from Major Kevin Ox here, who's in the main chat. He said there's a 3.4 megawatt generator farm at the Tent City was built. So I guess were you part of the Power Pro team that stood that up, I guess.
Cool. Thanks, sir, for adding that. I appreciate it.
All right. And I think we are at time here. So I am sorry we're not able to get to everybody's questions in here, but we much appreciate everybody's questions, and thank you all for staying here to the end of the presentation. So I wanted to take some time here to thanks to Captain Jagoda here for sharing your perspective, sharing this fascinating look inside the operation here. And then thank you to all of our attendees out here for taking the time to listen in for our webinar today. So if you are interested in submitting an article to the military engineer and perhaps being chosen to present at one of our TME Presents webinars here, please visit our website. It has our editorial calendar with all of the upcoming themes, main areas of focus, and deadlines for our article submissions. You can also find a library of our on-demand educational webinars and previous TME Presents webinars there. Just one last reminder before you leave, make sure you download your PDH certificate from the Handouts tab. The slide deck is available for download there as well. So on behalf of SAME, the military engineer, and our featured presenter, thank you all for joining us today. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.